A lot of people assume that having really low energy means that there's something clinically wrong with them, like an iron or B12 deficiency. And while sometimes that's true, what can even be more common are eating habits and patterns that quietly drain your energy behind the scenes every single day. I actually came up with over 20 eating habits that impact energy, and I distilled them down into the 7 that I see pretty much every single day in clinical practice. Women are more fatigued than ever. Low energy is one of the most common complaints I hear, and it honestly makes sense given the environment we're living in and the constant mental and physical demands most women are under. And this is also something that I've really struggled with myself over the last decade, and what I've both experienced and seen clinically is that even when nutrition isn't, let's say, the root cause of someone's chronic fatigue, it can absolutely make things better or worse. If I consistently did the habits I'm going to walk through today, I honestly don't think that I would make it through my day, which is why these are the ones I'd focus on optimizing first. So let's get started with number 1. One of the fastest ways to drain your energy early in the day is to spike stress hormones before your body has any real fuel. And while this might be a habit that you've heard of already, almost everyone underestimates how much it matters, and almost everyone does it, including myself. Number 1 is treating coffee as your first meal. Many people put coffee into their body as the very first thing in the morning. And while yes, a lot of people, including myself, would benefit from having food first, or at least having coffee alongside a meal, what I really mean by treating coffee as your first meal is the pattern where someone has coffee and then doesn't eat for hours afterwards. Coffee and caffeine suppresses appetite, so it can feel very easy to get away with this and like you're not doing anything wrong. You don't feel hungry, you feel alert, so it's easy to assume that you don't even need to have food yet. But behind the scenes, there's actually a lot happening. So from a physiological standpoint, caffeine on an empty stomach increases cortisol and adrenaline without giving your body any incoming energy. That forces your system to rely on those stress hormones and stored fuel to keep going. Over time, this can contribute to blood sugar instability, energy crashes later in the day, and feeling wired early but exhausted by the afternoon. All right, habit number 2. When this particular factor is missing in the morning, blood sugar tends to rise and fall more sharply, which sets you up for crashes, cravings, and low energy later on. So the second habit that can crush your today's gonna be a good day energy goals is not getting enough protein at breakfast. Protein at breakfast matters for a few reasons. The first one is blood sugar stability, which we've already touched on. Protein, especially when paired with fat, slows digestion and glucose absorption. That leads to more stable blood sugar and more consistent energy. The second reason protein matters is because it provides amino acids that your body uses to make neurotransmitters and support mitochondrial function. Your mitochondria are essentially your energy producing centers, and they rely on adequate protein intake to function efficiently. When protein intake is consistently low earlier in the day, energy production can feel sluggish, even if calories look fine on paper. And the third reason protein is so important is appetite and energy regulation. So a protein-forward breakfast tends to improve our satiety hormones, which reduces the likelihood of intense cravings or overeating later on. So in other words, it sets the tone for how stable your energy feels the rest of the day. So we've talked about some morning habits, and the next habit is one that can definitely start in the morning, especially if you lean on habit number 1. But it can also carry throughout the entire day and really impact you at any time. Habit number 3 is long gaps between meals. When you go long stretches without eating, your blood sugar drops, cortisol and adrenaline rise to compensate. And this might feel fine at first, especially if you are busy, you're not very hungry, like we talked about with coffee. But it's an expensive way to create energy for your body. Over time, relying on these stress hormones instead of actual fuel often leads to brain fog, irritability, and that familiar afternoon wall that so many women hit. This also commonly shows up when people wait too long to eat after exercising and just don't realize how much that delay ultimately impacts their energy later on in the day. Habit number 4 is really interesting because a lot of times we think that we're doing something beneficial or balanced for ourselves, but this is one of those habits that ends up backfiring more often than not and makes energy much worse. Habit number 4 is saving calories for dessert or alcohol. What actually makes this habit backfire is that both dessert and alcohol are metabolized much better when there's already sustenance or food on board. With alcohol, most people have heard some version of don't drink on an empty stomach, and there is a real physiological reason for that. Alcohol is detoxified through enzymes that rely on nutrients, especially zinc. When you drink without eating, your tolerance is lower, stress hormones rise more quickly, and the body has fewer resources available to process the alcohol efficiently. Dessert works similarly from a blood sugar perspective, and both alcohol and sugar have a strong impact on glucose regulation. When they are consumed on their own, especially after a day of underfueling, blood sugar tends to rise and spike higher and then crash harder. So I've seen this really clearly because I look at hundreds of continuous glucose monitor reports. When someone has protein, fat, and fiber in their system first, then has dessert or alcohol, the glucose curve is much steadier. The biggest spikes and crashes I see are almost always from having alcohol on its own, or let's say having alcohol at like the happy hour time before eating, or someone having dessert on its own. Having them with or after a meal actually dramatically reduces the likelihood of a big crash later, including what people often describe as a sugar hangover the next day or fatigue. So in this situation, ask yourself, what's your priority here? Is it energy or is it calories? So another habit that's disguised as healthy and is also just really convenient, it's even like wellness trendy vibes, but still drain energy because it's often incomplete and doesn't function as a real meal and can have a similar effect as the giant bowl of carbs in the morning, is treating smoothies as meals, especially when they're basically just fruit and liquid. Now, to be clear, you can absolutely make smoothies that work well for energy. When smoothies include enough protein, fiber, and fat, like a protein powder, nut butter, or avocado, they can be very supportive. And honestly, I'm really impressed by how many of my patients do this well at home. Where this habit becomes a problem is what commonly happens in real life, which is grabbing smoothies on the go. A lot of juice bars and even the trendiest smoothie places load their smoothies with multiple fruits, fruit juices, dates, and other concentrated sugars, and then protein is either minimal or treated like an optional add-on. I noticed this myself recently. I stopped at a Whole Foods to grab a smoothie and I asked if they could add like collagen or some kind of protein, and they didn't even have any protein options available at all behind the counter. That surprised me because it shows how normalized it is for smoothies to be almost entirely built around sugar. And you're gonna understand even more why this type of smoothie can be especially problematic once we talk about the next habit. Now, habit number 6 is one of the most confusing ones because of the rules and noise around this macronutrient that have created a lot of unnecessary fear. And when fear drives food choices, what usually follows isn't balance, but misapplication. Habit number 6 is carb fear, carbohydrate fear, and the misapplication of carbohydrates. So earlier on in the video, I've given some examples of how carbohydrates can negatively impact energy, like eating a bowl of processed carbs at breakfast. And this is where some of that confusion comes in because not all carbs behave the same way in the body. One helpful way to think about this is the difference between cellular and acellular carbohydrates. So cellular carbohydrates are whole food sources of carbohydrates where the cell walls are still intact. So even starchier things like potatoes, rice, beans, squashes, fruits, would count as those cellular carbs. Acellular carbs are carbs that have been processed and ground down into a flour and then turned into something else. So bread, cereal, pastries, crackers, etc. We tend to think about carbs in a very black and white terms. So carbs are either good or bad, and a lot of nuance gets missed here. For many women, going too low in carbs can actually create more problems than it solves. So what I commonly see happen with carb fear is that women avoid some of those cellular whole food sources of carbs and starches in particular, like rice, potatoes, and root vegetables. And these are normally the more complex carbs that actually get released more slowly into the bloodstream and contain more fiber. But then as we do that, cravings build, and those carbs get placed with higher sugar foods like smoothies, energy date balls, those like protein bars with dates, desserts, or snacks later in the day. So in this situation, carbs aren't actually eliminated. They're just applied in a way that leads to more blood sugar swings and, unfortunately, more energy crashes. Carbohydrates also play a really important role in supporting serotonin production, our neurotransmitter, helping the nervous system feel safe and fed. So basically supporting mood in a sense of calm. For active women especially, consistently under-eating carbohydrates can lead to fatigue, poor recovery, mood changes, and even menstrual cycle disruptions. From an energy standpoint, I would much rather see someone eat a few servings of starch throughout the day, feel more stable, and have fewer cravings than avoid carbs completely and end up binging on sugar at night. The last habit is one of the most overlooked when it comes to energy and has less to do with how much you're drinking and more to do with when. Habit number 7 is drinking alcohol during the luteal phase of your menstrual cycle. See, during the luteal phase, the body has higher energy demands and is already under more metabolic and hormonal stress. Blood sugar is less resilient, sleep is more sensitive, and the liver is working harder to process hormones. Alcohol adds an extra burden on top of that. Even small amounts can worsen sleep quality, increase blood sugar swings, and leave you feeling more fatigued, flat, and drained the next day, especially if alcohol intake is coming in on a rolling basis. I know that this is really hard to hear, especially because the luteal phase is half of your cycle, but I just want to be honest. It's pretty rare for me to drink in my luteal phase, and even more so in the PMS window. This is such a big deal for me in terms of how it impacts my energy and my mood that I have an entire video on this. So if you want a deeper breakdown of why this happens and how to approach alcohol more strategically across your cycle, then check out this video, and hopefully I'll see you in that one.